Yes, hello and welcome. I'm Oliver Mantell from the Audience Agency, and we're going to be talking for the next hour about the latest wave of the Cultural Participation Monitor. As I said, pop questions in the chat, or if you want to on the way through, but we do have a Q&A bit at the end. Because we're trying to keep this quite tight on timings, if people want to stay and ask questions afterwards as well, that's very welcome. For the purposes of audio description, I'm a middle-aged, white, blonde-haired male sitting in front of a couple of posters, and there's also automatic transcriptions available. So if you just look on the bar at the bottom, that should be available there. And most of this will be me talking, but we're also joined very kindly by Tom Dykes from the Association of Cultural Enterprises, what they have supported part of this wave. So he'll be saying a little bit about their response to that as well. So hello to Tom, and you'll hear from him in a little bit. Now, many of you will have come to various of these in the past. As I say, it's the 7th wave of the monitor, but just a little bit of background for those who haven't. The Cultural Participation Monitor is a nationally representative survey, so it's based on the whole population, not just attenders. And we've been doing it in several waves all the way through since October 2020. You can see that there are sample sizes and wave dates there. And this one is from, well, I would say quite recently, but it's a whole Prime Minister ago, but in early September was the actual field work on this one. So these responses, we're looking at a range of topics, including the cost of living. Clearly, some of the specifics on the ground will have changed in those intervening weeks, but this hopefully will give a snapshot about where the population was at, how they were feeling at that stage, and indeed some things arguably have tipped a little bit back towards that previous position anyway, in terms of guarantees till April, but not necessarily beyond. So some of the questions about concerns, to some extent, might have settled back. But anyhow, so that's the monitor itself. It's whole population. We do include looking at change, although I'm mainly going to be focusing today on this last wave, or maybe the change since the spring this year. And we include information about our segmentation model, audience spectrum. So if you're unfamiliar with that, there might be points where you want to just open the audience agency website in the background and have a quick check on what we're talking about. But I'll try and explain it as we go. So originally, this was part of a funded project through the Centre for Cultural Value, but we've kept it going since then because people were saying that it was really useful to them, but with very grateful support from organisations, including Association for Cultural Enterprises, who've helped on this one. So we've included some particular questions relating to shops and retail and cafes. We'll include some information about that in this presentation, but we'll also talk about that more separately, both sort of in written form and also on future events. So Tom might mention that later on as well. In terms of what it covers, it's about cultural participation, as the name would imply, but also a lot of other things in terms of key issues, attitudes, things that might be affecting people. And we're in a sort of interesting point at this particular stage, because we've still got the tail end of lots of the COVID issues and topics. We've got cost of living, but then we've also pulled out some other key areas as well. So we'll be looking at those, but also at what we're referring to as everyday participation, so kind of participatory activity, which obviously chimes quite neatly with the Arts Council new strategy, and obviously lots of thoughts about that being topical this week. So we'll also looking at the sort of shops information as well. So that's what we'll be looking at. I'll have to be fairly brisk on some of this because there's so much in the time. Certain bits of it we'll pull out in more detail elsewhere, and there's some bits we have covered in separate bits, and I'll direct you to where those are as we go through. But in essence, this is what we're looking at. So COVID and cost of living particularly, but also just some general things about engagement of various sorts, retail offers, looking towards the future and thinking a bit about implications of how all this knits together. I should probably say at the outset that I'm a delightfully sunny and optimistic person, and I say that because you may not get that impression from everything else I say over the next hour. But without any spoilers. Let's move straight on. So, first things first, attitudes to COVID. So we've seen throughout all the different waves, substantial levels of concern about COVID, and to some extent that still persists, but it has been going away, and you can see pretty much once we got to the autumn last year, from then it's been a bit of a gradual slide as things have tapered away, or maybe more accurately since the beginning of the kind of later waves, it's sort of tapered. But generally speaking, people are increasingly worried about falling ill with COVID. It's not gone away. You can see it's still there. 40% of people agreeing that they're worried about falling ill from COVID, and that has meant that, broadly speaking, people are more likely to be happy to attend. So you can see that sort of big rise in terms of potential attendance. Again, from that sort of similar point, but there is still a certain amount of reluctance for certain groups, and we've been talking about that quite a lot over recent months. That it's the groups that are most likely to want to attend or be happier to attend tend to be urban, they tend to be young, they tend to be families, they tend to be highly engaged. So if people are super motivated by the arts, then obviously they're keener to get back. As a result, people who are less engaged, older, more rural, less urban, etc., will have a tendency to be more hesitant. The other thing, of course, is disability is another key factor. You can see here that the proportion of disabled people saying they're happy to attend is almost 10% lower than for the population as a whole. It's lower still for over 65s, but it's still higher than where the population as a whole was if we look back even just 6 months. So there's a sort of an overall movement. It's still and has been consistently lower for those groups by about 10% or more, and so that pattern is continuing. Okay. There is some latent concern, and also there is still some responses that are indicating that people like the idea of COVID safety measures, which obviously is a bit tricky given that lots of places rather move beyond that, but we're still seeing over half the population saying they might be a bit more likely to attend with certain safety measures in place. Now, we might think this is just about people sort of naturally expressing a bit of caution. I certainly wouldn't presume that this means that there's a definite kind of demand, but it is worth noting, particularly that kind of fifth of the population who say they're a lot more likely to go. That is obviously quite substantial as a group of people who are giving a strong view on that. Okay. So by and large, COVID has been ebbing in terms of impact. It's still there. We'll see whether, as we get into deeper into the winter, that starts to rise again. But of course, the big topic that's been on everyone's minds is cost of living, and so this is from right at the end of August into early September, when it was already quite evident that the cost of living crisis was coming, but we hadn't had the initial, the first large bills actually arriving. So that's the kind of scene setting on it. So what we wanted to get a sense of was, how widespread is the concern? Are we talking about it as an issue which really strongly affects maybe a small subset of the population, but most people think actually we can ride this out, we're not too worried? Is it more widespread than that? And even if people are worried about it, how will that play through into their behaviour? Will people actually say, well, because of this, I'm going to stop doing cultural things, or not? This is the bit where the news isn't good, really. So coming into this situation, we had almost half the population saying they felt financially worse off than before the pandemic. So we're starting from a slightly rocky position in any case. There is a small group who are better off, generally speaking, highly engaged, more affluent professional groups who maybe have saved money on things like commuting, but not lost elsewhere. But generally speaking, lots of people saying they feel worse off. and then the cost of living comes through, and we're seeing really very large proportions saying that they are worried about the effects of the cost of living crisis on their household, and how it actually directly affects them. I mean, here we've got, it's 4 in 5 people, but if we just look at the people who strongly agree with that, who are saying that they strongly agree they're worried, it's still almost half. So, really large numbers of people really very concerned. And that does play through very directly into people saying, well, I'm going to have to cut back on spending elsewhere. And particularly, as we'll see in a second, culture and leisure becomes, it's one of the key things that people think, well, that's the thing that we can save money on. So people are looking to do less paid for stuff. They're looking to travel less. They're also looking to do more free things. So clearly, if you've got a free offer, that's potentially positive. But it does obviously raise challenges for those who don't. Okay. We do see some variation by different types of people. So this is using the audience spectrum groups, and I should flag that Emmy is metroculturals. It's not me. I'm very much not in that group, but it tends to be those groups on the left-hand side, the ones that are coloured in sort of orangey red, are the really highly engaged groups, and so they're a little bit less concerned. Those two groups there. Groups that are particularly concerned would include frontline families who are sort of typically kind of low-income, younger family groups, which is exactly who you'd think would be most directly affected. But of course, people's level of concern is kind of internally, it's benchmarked against their own circumstances. So the actual direct practical impacts may well be substantially higher for certain groups more than others. But even so, we can see levels of concern are different. And worth noting that if this is a kind of net figure, there's very few people disagreeing with this statement. It's everyone is either definitely worried or fairly neutral. Okay. So this is where we started to look at, if people are worried, which clearly was most people, then where do they think they might cut back on their spending? Now, a small number of people said they wouldn't cut back, but by and large, most people said they would. And if we look at particular activities, we've got almost a third of people saying that they would decrease spending on entertainment and leisure a lot. So again, that's a really kind of substantial top line figure. And when we gave people a list of various particular measures and said, well, which of these are you going to cut back either a lot, a little, or not at all, we could see that certain things came out as being much more prominent than others. So here we've highlighted in sort of pinky red all of the ones where more people are saying they're going to reduce it a lot than reduce it a little. And you can see that entertainment and leisure outside the home is firmly into that group. So the one thing that people are really adamant that they're going to cut back on is kind of shopping for fun, retail shopping. But after that, entertainment and leisure is right in that kind of next rank of things. People say, yes, that's where we're going to make the savings. Of course, some things people really can't make as many savings on, things like household bills, clearly, that's particularly now quite tricky. But notably, entertainment and leisure in the home is faring rather better than entertainment and leisure outside the home. So there might be a greater risk of people cutting back their kind of theatre trips than the Netflix, for example, even though we know that that is itself also happening. Okay. So this I won't talk about in enormous detail, partly because we did an event talking about this particularly recently, and the video of that is available online. So anyone that's interested in this, from my brief intro, can go and find the sort of 20-minute version available online, which is either on our YouTube channel or indeed via the audience agency website. But essentially, we looked at all the different things that people said they might cut back on, and did a sort of cluster analysis to say, well, what are there sort of common groupings that people say we'll cut back on these combinations or those combinations? And by and large, what we saw was there's a chunk of people who aren't looking to cut stuff back down, and that's true across the board. There's a bunch of people who want to cut everything back a lot. So that's a group F there on the right. And then in between, there's people who will trim everything, that's going to be, and then you've got other combinations of particular things. So our group C here want to cut back on their bills, but they're not necessarily cutting back so hard on everything else. D are cutting back on leisure and going out. E, it's more the kind of holidays and going out, so they might be keeping going with a bit of leisure spend to a slight extent. We can see that for each of these groups with these different behaviours, they have a disposition to be more likely to be based in certain places, to be certain types of people, to have certain demographics, to have certain cultural interests. So that's what this is trying to summarise. So it's essentially saying, if you want to think about who isn't cutting back, they're more like the characteristics listed under column A, the people who are more likely to be cutting back quite hard under F, and so forth. So it's a tendency in those directions. It's not saying that everyone in the group listed, for example, in the segments listed, is in that group. It's just saying they're relatively more likely to be in that group. But if we look at the proportions, it's about 1 in 6 saying they're not looking to cut back. And then you've got the rest of the population, so that it's really kind of large groups. A quarter saying actually we're going to cut back right across the board as much as we can, with some variation in between. So it's a fairly stark picture in terms of the implications. Yeah, the concern, generally speaking, going that way. So, as I say, there is more detail on that available on our website. And indeed, one of the sections later on, when we talk about everyday participation, we're going to do another event all about that early next month as well. So again, I won't dwell on that too much. So engagement, overall engagement and participation. So people are still being active, or certainly have been being active up to this point. Most people, fully 90% of people having done one of a range of activities. Film continues to be the most popular, but there are still, good numbers of people who've been going to events in the course of this year. And we did some analysis of audience finder data where we looked at, Isaac, who was actually on the call, did a lot of the work, so credit to him. But we looked at a standard set of 100 organisations for a couple of months on average before COVID, a couple of months this year, earlier this summer, and we could look to see which types of people, which types of art forms, etc., had gone up or down. And generally we found that at least for that window, at least for that cohort of 100 organisations, ticket sales appeared to have briefly got almost back on average, but with huge volatility. So loads of organisations doing better or worse than they typically would. Lots of variation by broad categories of respondents. We could see clear patterns. It's quite hard to see patterns in which organisations were doing better and worse, though. It was really quite a mixed picture. But lots of volatility. So it could well be, if you're seeing your figures heavily down, even though the overall picture we're saying did briefly get back to that kind of level, it could just be part of that kind of lots of people are outside the normal bounds. So we are seeing plenty of engagement that has been happening. We have still seen that emphasis towards the kind of younger, higher engaged urban family and groups, etc. But we are nonetheless seeing engagement rising. So if we look at the wave 6 compared to wave 7, we can see a kind of across the board overall engagement levels are kind of have been sort of pulling upwards quite substantially. With some groups stand above or below in both waves, but nonetheless same direction of travel. Okay. In terms of online engagement, obviously there was lots of talk about this when there was all the lockdowns and so forth, but there's still, even at this stage, lots of people having done online activity in the last 12 months. And we can see that's still true across the board. Streaming is still, sticking out way out ahead. But we can see if we split it by age category of respondent, there's a very, very steep gradient on that. And of course, given what I was saying about in-person attendance, there is a certain amount of doubling up where some people are doing both in person and online, and other people are doing neither. So there's a bit of a kind of age gradient on that. But nonetheless, quite substantial with big differences in terms of profile. So some of these groups that tend to be younger, tend to be more urban, tend to be more highly culturally engaged and or engage in a wider variety of art forms, coming out a little bit higher. Some of the typically lower engaged groups, but which tend to be more urban or younger on average, are also coming out a little bit higher. But we're seeing like the home and heritage, particularly, kind of slightly older, often quite rural group. They're down on attendance a lot. They're down on online engagement. There's a real sense there's a cohort of otherwise moderately engaged people who are kind of drifting away a bit in terms of engagement. And if we split it by our new second, I say new, not that new anymore, but newish, second tier of audience spectrum, we can see its particular subtypes that seem to be the ones that are driving this online engagement. And metroculturals 2, experience seekers 2, kaleidoscope creativity 2 are all the younger of those two pairings. So it's that kind of younger and more skew. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Ollie. Sorry, just quickly. Someone was just asking the previous slide, just where I want it. What was the stat for the 75+ age group with online engagement? Just wondering if you could quickly show that one again.
Here, so it was 33%. Having done any of the list of online activities one or more time in the previous 12 months. It is probably also worth noting that because this is an online survey, it is going to artificially inflate overall digital engagement. So I would imagine that, if you like, for that age group particularly, it might be we're getting slightly more engaged people than the others would be. Okay. So we've said that online engagement has continued, and appetite for it has continued as well, but we are still seeing people saying they're not really sure how to find online content, or sort of maybe sort of being so aware of it. And if they were more aware, they maybe would continue to engage. So that's maybe something to think about. I think it's quite tricky if you think from an audience point of view, beyond just sticking in, I don't know, online dance Google or something, how exactly people would really have a particular prominent awareness of individual platforms. So that's maybe something for us to think about. I mean, when I say platforms, I mean if each of us are doing content separately, that's potentially the challenge. But nonetheless, people are still doing it. They're doing it more than they were on average. So yeah, there is clearly an ongoing engagement. What's also seems to be going pretty well is about people doing creative activities in general. So it looks like across the board, about 5% of people think that they're doing more in the last 12 months than they used to do of a wide range of participatory activities. So that's potentially sort of like a positive message. We've also looked at the types of things we're talking about in a slightly broader way this time than we previously have, or typically would. So where, for example, we asked people, have you done visual arts? We would include specifying that could include graffiti, or it could include other types of visual arts. We've also got separate categories in there. We have sort of about creative nature, creative practice with nature. So things like kind of sort of creative gardening and bonsai and flower arranging and so forth. Really making explicit that those are creative activities, and we're not just asking about kind of traditional fine arts. And you can see the effect of this sort of shift to the way of thinking about and asking about creativity. If you look at what the results we got in wave 6, the results we got in wave 7. So in wave 6, we asked about this longer time period. Have you done any of these things since the start of the pandemic? So that was in spring, asking it back essentially 2 years. And 45% of people said, yes, I've played music, I've done writing, I've done photography or whatever. When we made it really clear that these categories could be much broader and could be much more inclusive, even just in the last 12 months, that proportion has jumped to 85% of people, so kind of 6 out of 7 people. And I think, it's for different organisations at different moments. You may want the narrower or the wider definition, but it's worth noting that actually creativity and creative practice is something that's incredibly widespread across the population, but expressed in different ways. So it's not the case that there's a few people that do creative things and then it's everybody else. It's most people are doing creative things of one description or another, whether they're kind of fine art, high art, whatever you want to call it, will vary. But certainly, the creativity is happening. It's particularly happening amongst younger people. So most categories of creative activity were higher for the sort of younger age groups. So some exceptions. We asked about reading, which there's all sorts of interesting theoretical debates about whether that's creative practice or not, but that does tend to increase with age. But most things were very much in the other direction. Okay. So, do we have any other questions to this point? Just because yes, I've got the chat.
Someone just asked, is playing games with like a controller considered to be creative? And I'm trying to recall actually whether that's included.
So it's creative games, not just gaming. So it would be Minecraft, but it wouldn't be Mario Kart, for example. To name the 2 main activities of, in our household. Yes. Okay, so looking to the future, what people expect to do. So we'd seen across various previous waves, and we hoped would go away, the idea that people were expecting to attend less post-pandemic than they previously did. That largely hasn't gone away. So people are expecting to continue to attend less in the future, with the exception of outdoor parks, gardens, etc., where we saw a kind of spike in interest during the pandemic. People have found new places, they've done more in those activities, and that looks like that may well persist. We're also seeing a tendency for people's worlds to have got a little bit smaller in terms of how far they want to travel to things. People in general expecting to stay close to home. From other questions, there is an indication that that could partly be about travel costs and fuel costs and things. But I think because we've seen it happen even before we started seeing the rise in those other costs, it's probably just that people are kind of staying a bit more local and thinking a bit more local, and indeed in loads of cases actually working at home, and therefore pretty much more people in that sense. Although, if I remember correctly, it's not specifically the working from home people who are the ones who are most likely to stay more local in terms of attendance, interestingly. So it might be that once you spend your whole day at home, you may then be more prepared to travel compared to someone that's not. So anyway, a tendency towards attending a bit less. And if we look at how that varies by people's assessment of their financial situation, we can see that particularly those people who feel like they're worse off are expecting to stay more local. So again, that may fit in some of that previous picture. So, everyone with me so far? Is this all? I see there's lots of things in the chat, but is that all?
There was just a question about creative activities, which I said we could either come back to at the end or we can address now.
Yes, people saying their Mario Kart is quite creative. Yes.
Yes, just a question about a film and versus reading, whether reading is up for debate, but it's just a point about that everybody reads, well, most people read, so we don't include it in the abstracts, do we?
Yeah, so as the aggregate, we take it out of the kind of, you've done anything creative. Alex makes a really good point there about programming is obviously driving lots of this changes in activity, which I think will be true. And will also affect some of the the online engagement. Okay, so this next bit was intended to be less immediately kind of topical of the moment and more about sort of how people tend to engage in particular. And there's a range of different questions we asked in partnership with Tom from ACE about people's purchasing habits, a few of which we pulled out here. But we wanted to get a bit of a sense of, yes, how those behaviours might be changing, but also what proportions and what types of people want certain things. And feeding into that, what the appetite or potential opportunity was around sort of environmental and sustainable offers as well. So whether that's something that it's worth people really prioritizing and prioritizing particular areas or particular groups. And clearly we know that there's obviously, you know, ever increasing topicality of that as an issue. So I want to kind of look at that. So what do we find? Well, the first thing, and this won't be a surprise in terms of the overall picture, given what we've said about, you know, people are feeling less well off and worried about the finances. People are expecting to visit the retail offers less than before the pandemic, but that's particularly true of gift shops rather than cafes. So you're likely to see a greater drop in footfall in relation to kind of shopping offer as opposed to the kind of refreshment offer. So that's maybe something to keep an eye out for. And obviously also think about which groups are feeling most pinched and therefore how that might play out in terms of what kind of things they want, which we'll touch on as well. We also asked, and there's lots of granularity on that which we don't have time to go into now, but we asked whether who people bought the last time they went to a gift shop, who did they buy for? Were they buying for themselves? Were they buying for others? And this may just be because my focus hasn't generally been retail, but I was surprised quite how prominent people buying themselves stuff was, as opposed to buying for others, particularly buying for children, which is the thing I find myself mainly doing when I go to museums and things. However, once you start looking at the demographics, boom, there I am, right in that category. I say right in, just in that category. And so yeah, so families, there's a much stronger tendency to be buying for the children you're with, and younger groups are much more likely to be buying for themselves. So generally speaking, the older the respondent, the less likely they were to be buying for themselves. Also, which is kind of like an interesting effect, I thought, for both the child and adult categories, retirees are more likely to be buying for people they weren't with, so buying it and then giving it later, whereas all of the younger age groups were much more likely to be buying for those they were with, which sort of feels like an interesting shift and difference in terms of overall mindset. Lots of other granularity that sits behind this, but that's a kind of an overall picture. There was also a greater tendency for men to buy for other adults and women to buy for children, it seemed, which feels like it rather too closely reinforces gender stereotypes to be entirely comfortable, but nonetheless is what people were telling us. So we also looked at purchasing patterns or preferences in terms of cafes. So we said, you know, which of these categories, which of these things do you look for when you're looking to purchase from a cafe? And locally sourced ingredients, you know, 1 in 5 people saying that's something they actively look for, which is just, you know, pretty high. But also notably across this set of categories, it's over 40% of the population are saying at least one of these things is what they're looking for. So I think there's a sort of there's an easy assumption to make. There's the standard thing that people look for, and then there's other exceptions. What we're saying is actually the exceptions are almost half. So, you know, actually it's just about a variety of offer, which is kind of a key thing. For a couple of these options as well, we can pull out a few more differences. So we can see, for example, if 1 in 7 people are saying they're looking for vegetarian options, that's much higher for some groups than others. And it sort of sounds obvious when you say it, but actually providing strong vegetarian offers is partly about a kind of diversity benefit. It's obviously particularly prominent amongst Asian populations, but also higher for metroculturals, it's higher in London, it's higher for women, it's higher for younger groups. So all of these are kind of essentially your tofu eating wokarati. There we are, they're all there in that category. So you may not be surprised, but nonetheless, the evidence does back it up. So we also asked people, if you were looking at buying something from a shop at a cultural organisation, would you be prepared to pay more or not for green or more sustainable options? And this feels like data that you could read in one of a couple of different directions, depending how you are minded. Most people said that they would pay more for sustainable options. So that might be considered a positive if that's what you're trying to encourage. But the actual proportion who are prepared to pay substantially more is pretty small. So we're talking 11% of people, 1 in 9 people saying they're prepared to spend at least a fifth more. And we did actually spell this out as, so for example, something that would have cost £10 would be £12. So we're not talking necessarily about huge cash differences, but it's about relative value. So the way that I've thought about this really is that it seems to be those sort of like light green audiences. Broadly speaking, if it's not too painful, if it's not too inconvenient, there's a tendency towards, yes, okay, we'll go for the green option, but don't make it too expensive. So that does suggest to me that there are opportunities there, but obviously value remains really key. It's part of it. For those who said they weren't prepared to pay more, which was after all, over 4 in 10, we also then asked them, if it was the same price, would you rather have the green option? Is it just, is it just cost holding you back? You do still actually prefer it, you just wouldn't want to pay more for it. And about half of them went that way. Almost the same proportion said they didn't really care, but there were a full 5% of the population who, given the choice at no extra cost, would rather not have the green version. So I guess you've got this kind of 1 in 20 real kind of green refusers. So it's quite a small group, but it's worth noting that, that is there in the mix. But in general, people are sort of saying, yeah, if it's about the same price or slightly more, why not? If you put those together, you've got almost exactly 50%, and they wouldn't pay more, but they prefer it, or they'd pay up to 10% more. So, that's most people that come in there. Very narrow band. Those who were most prepared to spend more, there's some interesting, maybe slightly surprising results here. Tended to be younger groups, families, and this I found quite fun. The highest group amongst families are those with sort of 6 to 10-year-old children. I sort of wonder if it's about kind of modelling a certain behaviour to children when they're old enough to be aware of it. So they're trying to kind of shape their perceptions, but also actually lower engaged audience spectrum groups. So you might have assumed that it was all the kind of metrocultural experience seekers, the really high engaged groups, but actually lower engaged groups were prepared to say, actually, we'd rather pay for these options, for green options. Those who weren't prepared to pay more, one thing to note is that there's the single biggest difference was people who basically don't tend to attend cultural organisations were particularly likely to say, well, we wouldn't pay more for these things anyway. But also older groups, and of course, people who are feeling worse off. But notable actually that those other two things are a bigger driver of people being unlikely to pay more than simply kind of financial hardship. So it's not necessarily just about affordability, it's also just about broad attitudes. So I appear to have misplaced my slide where I was going to introduce Tom. So hopefully Tom can speak for himself, but it's Tom Dykes from the Association for Enterprises who helped support this overall survey, but actually particularly we consulted on these particular questions. So over to you, Tom.
Great, thank you, Oliver, and really nice to be here, and hello to everyone. Some really interesting analysis there, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to pick out 2 points which I think are particularly interesting for the people I work with, which is the commercial teams of cultural organisations. One, thinking about that, the cost of living crisis and the clear sense that people are feeling worse off and are the data seems to suggest likely to visit and spend less in organizations. So if the focus is on less footfall, particularly with retail, and to some degree in our food and beverage outlets, and the data seems to suggest people will be traveling less, maybe focusing on local venues, then we need to adapt our offers accordingly in both those areas. So, particularly with retail, it's focusing on those local audiences, and the same with food and drink. And there's, as Oliver said, we're going to look into the much more detail analysis that some of these questions gave us at a later point. But the other thing I wanted to pick up on is, if we're looking at things like sustainability, which for people I've been talking to is a huge area of debate in retail and food and drink at the moment, but a huge area of enthusiasm. There's a real sense that even though there is a cost of living crisis, even though we've come through COVID, this is still really high on the agenda for both consumers and for those of us providing that service. So it almost looks, Oliver, some of this stuff, it seems to be about sort of value-led as much as anything else. And it's a question for retailers in particular is, are we looking at taking a cut in margin to offer those prices at an affordable level if people over the next winter, over the next key Christmas trading period, aren't looking to want to spend much more on sustainable products, but they like the idea of spending or buying sustainable products, then I think we may need to make some difficult decisions about making them accessible and affordable, and whether that means we need to look at our margins. The same goes with food and drink. Really interesting to see those figures on vegetarianism and veganism. Again, probably a bit about focusing on local audiences. So if we're worried about footfall to the bars and restaurants and cafes, maybe looking at the offer to target local visitors more strongly with offers there. And also then if it's probably a case of looking at your ATV, if you're struggling with footfall over winter, which seems to be the data seems to suggest, what we saw during COVID in terms of retail and food and drink was obviously as the footfall crashed, ATV went up. So the people who were coming were spending a bit more. Can we try and replicate that over the winter with those people who are engaged? So it's a really mixed picture, but the last thing I'm just going to say is, Oliver mentioned earlier, is we're planning on doing a couple of articles in the association and the audience agency, and we'll be doing a one-off sort of session from cultural enterprises looking at some of these questions in much more detail. So if you or your commercial teams are interested, keep an eye out for that. For those of you who don't know who I am or what we do, Cultural Enterprises is a charity and sexy support organisation, and we focus on providing training and networking for the income generating side of cultural organisations. So really pleased to be looking at some of these questions as part of the wider wave. So yeah, keep an eye out for those future events, and we'll be looking into this in a bit more detail. So thanks, Oliver, back to you. Find that mute button.
There we are. Sorry, I hadn't had enough practice muting and unmuting myself. Yes, so just a few final things to draw together, and then if you have some time for some questions and conversation. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pull out, for a few particular questions, how they seem to be affecting different groups of people. Partly just to illustrate that it's a relatively more complex picture than some of the sort of the summary findings may suggest, but also to flag where I think there's particular challenge in relation to cost of living. So here we have the proportion of people who said that they were worried about the cost of living, and the proportion of people who said that they're worried about COVID, and particularly worried about they themselves catching COVID, arranged as a scatter plot by the different groups, with the dotted lines being the kind of the average. So we can see that some groups are more worried about both of these things, like trips and treats, up our street, frontline families up in the top right hand corner. But interestingly, some groups saying that they're less worried on both accounts, so community-led culture clubs. down the bottom left. So we've got this bit of a split between particularly family groups, particularly maybe slightly harder pressed groups, particularly worried on both fronts. And then a bit of variation amongst others. So the metroculturals we see are actually quite outspoken about saying actually COVID's a bit worrying, but they're still saying, as we'll see in a sec, that they're happy to attend, and they're not so worried about cost of living. They're relatively more cushioned from that. If we look at that willingness to attend then, and how that relates to the cost of living. So all the cost of living stuff will be the same, but community land culture buffs are telling us that relatively high proportions are willing to attend because I guess they're very, very into their culture. And we're seeing lots of the family groups in those top right-hand corner, trips and treats, Stormtree Pendables. Even some of the frontline families are relatively willing to attend, even though they're worried about the cost of living. Of course, we might have some concerns about how that might play out, but for the moment, they're saying, it's not COVID that's putting them off. Then here, finally, I mentioned that change analysis we did, where we looked at the relative likelihood of different segments to attend or not compared to before. So we've taken the summary results of that and comparing it to how willing people are to attend. We can see that actually people on the right of this are saying they're relatively willing to attend, but people at the top are the ones who are actually doing the greater level of attending compared to pre-COVID. And strikingly, slightly oddly, the metroculturals and community land culture buffs, the super engaged audiences who tell us they're willing to attend, tell us they're not as worried about some of these factors, in practice aren't turning out in the levels that we might previously have expected. So that in itself is a potential cause for concern, because although we've seen big drops in the home and heritage group, for example, right there at the bottom, almost a full third down in terms of pure numbers, they weren't such a big group to start with. But community land culture buffs is a massive group, so a small drop from them is actually quite a big drop in terms of overall attendance behaviour. We also see particularly some of the hardest pressed groups, so supported communities, so up our street, they are telling us they're less likely to attend, and indeed they are attending less. So we're seeing that sort of pinch happening on those, and indeed we'd expect those to be quite hard hit by cost of living issues as well. So that's a potential real challenge concern. However, it looks like we've got a few groups that are telling us they're willing to attend, and we're seeing that translate into behaviour. So particularly groups with high proportions of families, frontline families, trips and treats, Stormtree Dependables in particular, sitting at that top right hand corner where they're attending more, they're telling us they're attending, they are happy to attend more. But then we go back to think about who it was that said they were most concerned about the cost of living. And if we do that in order, is these four. So essentially we've had COVID and all the way that that's played out, which has kind of reduced certain groups of attenders, particularly kind of relatively older groups. And now cost of living is coming along, and it's really quite heavily targeted on precisely some of those groups who are otherwise making up the shortfall. So the concern would be that the cost of living effectively is affecting the bit of the audience that wasn't so much affected previously. So that is a potential concern as we go forward. And it suggests that although we've been saying for ages that family offers seem to be where there's lots of interest and potential, however, it might be that there'll be a lot of price sensitivity amongst those groups in any case. So there we are. So that's an initial summary. So we're seeing people less worried about COVID in general. Willingness to attend and attendance has been rising, but people are worried about the cost of living. They're saying it's going to affect their spend in a variety of different ways, as we've seen. That's true in cafes, despite the fact there's this interest in sustainable offers. So there's, as Tom was saying, it's a value choice there, and there's sort of a challenge. And there is an opportunity there, even though people are sort of pressured, given we've seen how that splits. Online awareness remains high. Engagement is still high, but there are gaps on awareness and people asking for clearer signposting. Lots of participation growth, particularly when we measure it in a more inclusive way. But people are generally sort of slightly hunkering down in terms of level of activity and also distance of travel. And there is this sense that maybe COVID, the cost of living is kind of taking over from where COVID left off, but kind of targeting different groups.